And I'm going to, of course, share my screen with you. So it's great to see everyone here today. I know there's quite a number of people registered, so I'm sure there'll be a few people joining. And as you know, I am recording this, and I will send out the recording and also have it put on a website where you can access it and either play it. I'll put it onto YouTube, and you'll be able to watch it directly from there. So it's a pleasure to be able to talk to you about teaching phonics in Spanish this afternoon. And first of all, the teaching of phonics using the phonics methodology is not a new thing. So it has been part of the Key Stage 3 National Curriculum Programme of Study in England since 2014. It doesn't actually use the phrase phonics, but it talks about pupils should be taught to explore the patterns and sounds of language, and it suggests some ways such as through songs, rhymes, and the link of spelling, sound, and the meaning of words. And we're going to go into more detail today about what actually does that phrase phonics mean. In addition, it's been mentioned very specifically in the Ofsted MFL review of June 21, so just over a year old, that there are 3 pillars of progression in the curriculum for modern foreign languages, the first of which is phonics. And I think rightly so that phonics has been placed first, because it's important when we're teaching children and young people a new language that we very early on teach the rules of phonics. If we leave it too late, then they might start to pick up poor pronunciation. They might apply the rules of pronunciation of English, their native language, to the foreign language. And once that starts to happen, and once they start mispronouncing words like choice in French, or they don't pronounce the E in Spanish, so rather than saying chocolate, they just say chocolate or chocolate, and they're using English pronunciation, then it's hard to change that. So phonics is now a key part of how we are supposed to be teaching a modern language. The Ofsted research review is definitely worth a read if you haven't looked at it. If you're a head of languages or a subject leader in languages, then you should be able to refer to it, especially in a deep dive conversation with Ofsted, and you should be able to talk about how the 3 pillars of progression of phonics, vocabulary and grammar are interwoven into your languages curriculum. So this MFL subject review does go into more detail about phonics. Even if you don't want to read all of it, I certainly recommend reading the summary at the beginning. And how it's defined is that phonics is the system of the sounds of the language and how these are represented in written words. It talks about the fact that clear and reliable pronunciation and the links between sound and spelling are integral parts of second language learning, and therefore a strong awareness of phonology is important. You've probably heard the phrase phonics being talked about in the teaching of English in primary school. So when children first arrive in a primary school, they're expected to be taught to read and write using synthetic phonics, which is a certain type of way of teaching phonics. And that is now government expectations. It's statutory. It's how children must be taught. In English, there are some different schemes that do that. There are things like read, write, ink, and letters and sounds. And it is actually much harder in English because the phoning, graphing link is not as clear, and we'll talk about what that means a bit later. So that's what phonics means. It's not the same as phonetics. So phonetics is often a study that if you've learned a language at university, then I just ask if people could please mute your voice. I think there's a bit of echoing going on. Sorry, mute your sound if you've just joined. I think we've got a couple of people there not muted. Thank you so much. So phonetics is different, and there's an international phonetic alphabet, and it's a sort of a way of translating sounds across lots of different languages into a visual form, but it's not the same as phonics. In addition, the Ofsted MFL review of 2021 says that high quality languages education may have the following features. that curriculum plans show clear logic behind the progression in phonics, and I'm going to talk to you and show you an example of a progression mat in phonics, and that there should be including around when to teach differences between English sound spelling correspondences and those of the target language. In addition, like with everything, in order to make the learning stick, there needs to be planned practice and review of phonemes. So it's not enough that we would just teach the phonemes once or twice. They would have to be repeated over and over again in order for that learning to stick. So those are some sort of verbatim quotes from the Ofsted MFL review. And then following that review, in January of this year, 2022, we received some new specifications for the GCSEs to start teaching in year 10 in 2024. And so it's for current year 7 and year 8 children. And these new specifications taught explicitly about children learning and applying the principles by which spelling represents sounds. So for the first time ever, actually the way young people are going to be assessed in their GCSEs is going to include some sort of phonics assessment in the sense of having to make the sound spelling link. And it's been said that they will need to undertake dictation of short spoken extracts, including some vocabulary from outside the vocabulary list. So that would be perhaps unknown vocabulary. So they would hear it, have to apply the rules of phonics to be able to write it down accurately. So the link to that is in there. I'm sure you've probably had a look at it already, but it's almost going back into the past. So I was the last year, many years ago in 1987, to take an O-level in French, and we had to do a dictation exam then, and we're now going back to that 25 years later, or probably more, 35 probably, because my maths isn't too good. So we're going to do a little bit of work now around I've used some words like phonemes and graphemes. We're going to do some work around what do these mean. The young people that you teach who come up from primary school, your year 7, your year 8 children, know what these words mean, and you can use them without concern in your language teaching, because what the good thing is that they will be able to make that link from prior learning, and you'll be using a word that they're familiar with. And it could well be that if you're not so familiar with phonics yourself, that your young people that you're teaching might be able to teach you, and you can ask them, what is a phoneme? Right, okay, so we know what phonemes are in English, let's think about them in Spanish. So here's something to think about. You could put an answer in the chat if you want. What is a phoneme, and can you give an example of a phoneme in English? Now, you might be too tired at the end of today. You might have been teaching all day and you just think, just tell me the answer, Wendy. I don't want to have to interact. And so that's absolutely fine. Okay, so can you give an example in Spanish as well, since hopefully you are all Spanish teachers who are listening today. Right, well, here are some answers. So a phoneme is the smallest single identifiable unit of sound. Okay, so some examples in English are sh, s, r. That O-U-G-H sound. Have a think about how do you pronounce that in English. Okay, I've actually been doing a review today in a primary school, and we've been talking about phonics and the comparison between English and Spanish and French phonics. And it turns out that the O-U-G-H sound can be pronounced in 7 different ways in English. Sorry, the O-U-G-H grapheme rather. So it could be pronounced uff as in tough, ow as in something that I can't think of, bough as in the bough of a tree, O as in dough, oo as in through, and or as in thought. So those are just 5 that I can quickly think of. That makes English quite difficult to learn because there isn't just one way of pronouncing a particular letter or letter string always. Okay, one of the reasons for that is that English is a bit of a mishmash of lots of different languages. We were conquered by William the Conqueror in 1066, and the upper classes spoke French for around 200 years here. So it brought lots of French words such as descendre, to descend, into the English language. And obviously Spanish and French are very similar, both Romance languages, and so therefore there's quite a lot of cognates or near cognates between French and Spanish and English. In addition, we've got the Anglo-Saxon influence into our language as well. And it therefore makes the learning of English quite difficult. And that is one of the reasons why there's quite a lot of dyslexia amongst English children. Or it's not that there are less children with the potential for dyslexia, but because it is such a hard language to make the sound spelling link with, more children struggle with it. Conversely, in Spain and with Spanish, Spanish is 99% phonetic. And so there is a lot less dyslexia amongst Spanish children, the same with Italian, also very highly phonetic. So there are some examples here in Spanish of different phonemes. So they could be single letters like a, s, o, the J sound, h, lovely sound that, isn't it? And then the R sound, r, which, not being a native Spanish speaker, I struggle with. I don't sound perfectly Spanish. And then we've got the y sound, the double L. So what is meant by to segment? So segment is a word that is used a lot in the primary classroom, and it's to do with the learning of phonics. What can we think it means? And if you were to ask a student to segment a word, what are you asking them to do? So for example, if I said to you, can you segment the word shop? What would I want you to do? I want you to split it into its component phonemes, essentially. So sh, o, p. How many phonemes? Hopefully you got it down to 3. So as we said before, it's a single identifiable unit of sound. Obviously, S and H separately are 2 separate sounds, and H in English. But in this case, they are a double letter sound, a sh sound, and therefore just one sound. Let's think about this in Spanish. Can you segment the word perro in Spanish? And how many phonemes does it have? I'll give you a few seconds to think about that. Okay, and hopefully you've got the answer. It's got 4, p, e, r, o. And the great thing about Spanish is that those phonemes are always pronounced in the same way. There is no different way to pronounce those particular phonemes. And so I would probably say that Spanish is one of the easier languages to teach, particularly in respect of pronunciation, because what you see is what you get. You don't need to think about different ways to pronounce it. French and German, just out of interest, are equally strict with their rules, but French does have the issue of the silent letters. Spanish just has one silent letter, which is the H in front of a word like hambre, hunger, and so on. But there's just one silent letter rule of pronunciation that has to be learned in Spanish. And then what is meant by to blend? And if I would say to you to blend those sounds, it means to draw together the individual phonemes to pronounce a word. And so if you think about children learning to speak and to read in English, they might be reading a book and they see a word, they see the word cat, for example, but they don't recognize it straight away. So they would sound it out and say k, a, t. And then to blend it, they would try and push those sounds together to say cat. And if you've listened to a child learn to read and come across a new word, that's the technique that you would have heard them use. And it's maybe a technique you might want to suggest once you've taught the phonemes, the particular important phonemes in the Spanish language, that you can suggest that young people apply those phonemes when they come across a new word. So there are 44 phonemes in English, mostly, although there are some parts of the country, like in the Northeast, that have a couple of extra phonemes that the rest of us don't. But if you were going to say, I would have previously said the Queen's English, but now I'd say the King's English, then you'd say that sort of strictly there are 44 phonemes in English. Now I'll give you a clue. Spanish is a much more simple language in terms of its phonemes, so it does have less. Does anyone want to put in the chat any idea? Just put a simple number for me. How many phonemes do you think there are in the Spanish language? Right, somebody's put 15, thank you. L. Jones. Does anyone else want to feel brave? You don't even have to write in Spanish. You can just put a number in. We've got 30 from Mrs. Ferris, thank you. It's good to know there are some people out there. It feels a bit strange sometimes just speaking to a computer screen. So thank you so much for giving it a go. Neither of you are right, but it's somewhere in between, and it's actually 25 phonemes in the Spanish language. So I want you to have a think now about the challenge of cognates. As I said before, Spanish is quite a simple language to teach in terms of pronunciation, but that doesn't mean that every word that you see is going to be easy to pronounce. And actually, if we look at cognates or near cognates and compare the English pronunciation and the Spanish, we can start to see where are some of the areas that the students that we are teaching are going to find more challenging. Okay, so this is an activity that's quite a nice one to do with your students, especially the older ones who maybe if you haven't taught them in the phonics methodology, you can start to pull things apart because they've already got a certain knowledge of Spanish. And a nice activity to do is to ask them to say either in their head or to say out loud these words in English and then in the Spanish pronunciation. And then start to say, okay, which phonemes, which sounds are going to be different, and which are the ones, therefore, that we will need to focus on that are the difficult phonemes that we actually have to teach specifically. So they might say agent, agente, euro, euro, chocolate, chocolate, June, junio, rugby, rugby. I can't do my trilled R, I'm afraid. Dragon, dragon, hamburger, hamburguesa, mountain, montaña, and so on. And by doing that, they can start to work out for themselves, and hopefully you can today as well, which are the phonemes that we will need to focus on, because young people are not automatically going to work it out. We don't need to worry about the phonemes that are identical between English and Spanish. So for example, the T sound in agente and agent, it's the same T sound. In the D sound in dragon and dragon are the same sounds. The F sound in football and football, exactly the same with M. Most of the consonants are identical, not every single one of them is obviously different, and the double L is different as well. But we can start to see some patterns going on here and see which ones we should focus on. In the Department for Education GCSE Spanish subject content, it provided a list of all the phonemes, in fact, in Spanish. And I would suggest teaching all of them, actually, but then going back and reinforcing based on how your young people are pronouncing and focusing on those phonemes that they are finding particularly tricky and not able to remember. So I would say you don't need to teach every single one, but the most difficult ones, and you probably, if you're an experienced teacher, this won't be a surprise for you. These are the ones that won't necessarily come naturally. The vowel sounds are important because there's just one way to pronounce a vowel sound in Spanish. But in English, for example, the A sound could be pronounced with a short A or a long R or an A sound. So there's several different ways in English. Obviously in Spanish, it's just the short A sound. The E sound, the letter E is obviously pronounced E, so quite different from English. And then the I sound is pronounced E, which can be confusing because it looks like it should be the letter E and so on. So we do need to teach those, and we just need to keep reinforcing them. We also have the issue of the G being pronounced differently depending on which vowel it's followed by. So we've got the che and the chi sound, and then we've got the gui and the go and the gu sounds. So where it's a hard G or a soft G. The same with the C sounds, depending on whether you speak Latin American Spanish or Castilian Spanish. You've either got the th soft sound, th and thi, or se and si, and then you've got the hard kako, ku. So the C and the G can be quite difficult. And actually, I remember learning Spanish. I did a 2-year course when I started at age 14, and it took me nearly a year to work out. I couldn't understand. I could see that C was pronounced differently, but the actual rule of pronunciation, nobody explained to me, and I just one day worked it out after several months of getting it wrong sometimes. And it would have just been much more simple if at the beginning my teacher had just said, C is pronounced like this when it's followed by a particular vowel. So that's where explicit teaching, rather than expecting our students to work things out, I think is so powerful. And it's so useful in Spanish because the rules are so uniform, and they're not really deviated from. So I want to talk you through now a method that I've used and I've developed for teaching Spanish phonics. It came out of a time when I taught in a primary school, in particular in year 5 and 6, and I used a phonics methodology. I sort of looked at how children were taught in English, the phonics, and some of the ways of teaching it, and then developed this methodology, and it's called Planetas Fonéticos. So each phoneme is an imaginary planet, not a real planet. Obviously, I did have to tell the children one time that we hadn't discovered a whole new planetary system, but it just makes it a little bit fun and motivating that we're going to go and visit El Planeta Che or El Planeta K and so on today, and that's our focus phoneme. So as I suggest, you don't need to teach every single phoneme, you don't need to teach all 25, you don't need to teach P and M and D because they will automatically get those right. But the phonemes that you can see in front of you are the ones that we do need to focus on, because those are ones that are different from English and that children can potentially struggle with. So I'm going to sort of show you the series of slides. There should be some sound to go with this as well. I'll just ask you to please make sure that you're muted, and hopefully we will be able to hear some sound as well. So what we would do to start with is do some revision of previously taught phonemes. So we're going to look at El Planeta Che, the J sound today, but previously children would have come across the th sound, the th and the the. So I would give them some either phrases or some simple sentences and ask them at the beginning to have a go at pronouncing these correctly. So we were applying previous knowledge, and it also helps me as a teacher to pick up on those phonemes that they perhaps are not fully embedded in their long-term memory as well.
Can you think of any words with a h sound in?
So I would then ask the students to think of any words with a particular sound in. I would tend to start teaching phonics after a few weeks of learning Spanish, maybe at the end of a half term. And the sorts of vocab that I'd expect the students to know already as a result of the first few weeks of teaching will be things like greetings, numbers, maybe 1 to 10, wherever you've got to, colours, probably family members, animals are usually taught early on. So the sort of normal things that you teach. And basically, the students need to have something to hook their learning onto. So a bit like when children start at reception in primary school and then learn to read and write, they have got a language, they've got a vocabulary in English. So therefore, when they're trying to sound out a word cat, they actually know that word cat. It's just that they didn't know what it looks like. So the young people need to have some language. It doesn't need to be a huge amount to begin with, but there has to be some knowledge. And as a result, I would say don't start in the first week, okay? Allow them to have a few weeks, first of all, of learning some language. So can you think of any words with a h sound in? And I would ask them to give me some words, and then I would write those words on the board, and I would draw a square around the focus phoneme, around the J, obviously, in this case. And then we're going to go and visit El Planeta Che.
El planeta.
Okay, so we've got that lovely sound, and when I play this, the students can't help but copy it because it's such a fantastic sound. So let's go and see what is on El Planeta, and it's only words that I've got this h sound in.
Naranja, conejo, junio, julio, rojo. Ojos.
And I might give them a merit point or something like that, a reward point, if they have said one of the words that comes up. Okay, and then the next thing that I'll do is I want them to try and focus their ears into just a particular sound. This is called a micro listening activity. And often as language teachers, we sort of skip this stage of language learning and we move straight into asking students to listen to full sentences or even words, but they are sort of skipping one point, which if they knew that whenever they hear the ch sound is going to be something with the letter J in, that is going to immediately start to help them make those links between the sound and also what the visual representation, the written version of the word is. So at the beginning of learning a language, helping to tune your ears into a language is a really good idea. So in this particular case, it's a rhyme, and I'd ask the students, I think that this comes at about number 9 in the list of phonemes. So they've already got used to listening for sound. I'd ask them to do a tally, maybe on a mini whiteboard or on the back of their book, of the number of times they hear the ch sound. Now, when I first start teaching using this technique, the students find it quite difficult to do that. But after about 3 or 4 weeks, it's like their ears become tuned into it and they become really good at it. So I would encourage you, when you're getting them to listen for a number of sounds, to persevere with it. At the beginning, I might just give them a simpler task where they just listen to 2 words and they have to tell me which word, is it the first or the second word. They can just hold up 1 or 2 fingers that they've heard that sound in. So that's a simpler one. It gets harder when you have to do a tally. Obviously, the longer it is, the harder it is, and the faster the speed is as well. It can be made more difficult. So let's have a listen to this and see if you can do me a tally of the number of times you hear the ch sound.
Vengan a ver mi granja, vengan todos. Vengan a ver mi granja que es hermosa. Y el perro hace así. ¡Guau, guau, guau! Vengan a ver mi granja, vengan todos. Vengan a ver mi granja, que es hermosa. Y la vaca hace así. ¡Mu, mu!
Okay, if you've been reading the transcript, I don't know if you can see it at the same time as me, but it's been interesting to watch how it's translated that into English. So next time we can have a look and we can also read it as well and see if we were correct.
Vengan a ver mi granja, vengan todos.
Okay, I won't play the whole thing again, but as you can see, we can then practice and go back and check whether we were right or not. The next activity it's important to do, so we're focused on listening now, is to look at a tongue twister. So tongue twisters are a great way because they often focus on a particular sound to actually practice the language. So we're focusing on this particular phoneme, but it's also bringing in other phonemes that we've previously learned. So it's another way of revising and revisiting previously learned language.
En un juncal de Junqueira, juncos juntaba Julián. Juntóse Juan a juntarlos y juntos juncos juntaron.
Okay, and I actually, in this case, I have another one, which is a much simpler, shorter one. So this would be a good way of providing curriculum adaptations to our students according to ability.
Jorge, el cerrajero, vende cerrajes en la cerrajería.
That in some ways is a harder one because it's got 2 other quite difficult sounds in the th sound and then the r, the trilled sound, which the native Spanish speaker there did so much better than me. And that for me is a really nice way of having a native speaker as the model, because although, you know, I can speak Spanish well, I'm not fluent, and I would love for my young people to hear the right model. And some of them are much better than me at rolling their R's and trilling their R's, and so they can have a go and listen to the correct version. So you could either ask the students to choose which one they want to practice and then perhaps do it in pairs, and even if you want and if they feel comfortable, get them to present it to the class as well. So we do some practice with a tongue twister, and then finally, as a sort of test and to check whether the learning has started to be embedded, we can ask our young people to listen to a series of new sounds that they've not heard before and then have a go at transcribing them.
Jamón, jamón, jamón.
Sorry, I think this one's gone a little bit funny and it keeps doing the same sound. So what it should normally, you should normally hear a series of different sounds, different words here. And then we're doing a little bit of transcription. So we're doing a bit of practice around dictation. If you feel that that's a step too far for your young people, we can just move to a simpler activity where we're asking them to just pronounce some new words, probably words that they've not come across before, and also integrating other phonemes that have been previously learnt. So I would get them to work in pairs, and they would practice saying this. Obviously, we've got the silent H going on here with hijo. We've got the I sound E that they'll have learned before, and we're revisiting that. We've got the O sound O that they would learn. I would certainly start with the 5 vowel sounds in terms of progression. They've got the A in jamón, and they've got the E in jersey, and so on. They've got an R there as well. So they're going to practice these words that they may not have come across before. It's ideal if they're fairly new words, but they are words that will form part of what they'll need to know during a GCSE language course. And then let's have a go at checking. We'll listen to the correct pronunciation now.
Hijo, jamón, jersey, jirafa, México, Jorge.
Okay. So that is a short little piece that will probably take about 10 to 15 minutes to teach. I would suggest doing something like that and taking the individual phonemes once a week during that first year of language learning in year 7, starting out around after half term. And it's practiced, it's consistent, it goes back and revisits previously learnt phonemes. And if you do it consistently, I've always found that by the end of year 7 or even by Easter, students are accurately pronouncing things, and it saves a lot of hassle in the future. It saves a lot of time having to go back and reteach pronunciation, because it gives them access to being able to pronounce anything new that they come across by applying those rules. And although it might take some time out of your curriculum in year 7, as I said, because of the time it will save later and the confidence that it will give young people in pronunciation, I think it's well worth it. And in fact, if you've ever done surveys or ever talked to young people about learning a language, just like it's not a surprise really, but they think that to be good at a language, you should be able to speak it. It's almost like, well, what's the point if I can read and write it? To me, the whole point is if I met a native speaker, or if I went abroad to Spain, that I would actually be able to have a conversation, to go and ask for something in a shop or order in a restaurant and actually make myself understood. And if they can't do that, no matter how good they are at reading and writing and maybe listening, they can't actually speak it, then they don't feel that they're very good at it. They have a lack of self-efficacy. And that's why it's so important that we get the phonics right, we get the pronunciation right, we give them the confidence, and then we practice the skill of speaking a lot in lessons. And it will help our young people to be much more confident and feel that they can speak the language. So as we said before, it's important that curriculum plans show clear logic. So when Ofsted say that it may have the following features, which is that first sentence in bold, it actually, what Ofsted really mean is it should do. Okay, they don't like to stipulate, to say this is what we have to see, but basically they put it in their research review and they made it really clear we do need to have a progression map for phonics, just as we do for grammar and for vocab. So what could that look like? We'll come to that in a second. We're first of all just going to have a quick look at assessment of phonics. And I would recommend that in the listening exam, because there is going to be some assessment eventually in GCSE, when you're redesigning some of your Key Stage 3 assessments, you might want to think about an assessment such as the one below, and what you could do, or you could read out the words and the children have to fill in the gaps. So it's quite simple, it's not too challenging, and it would focus on some of the key phonemes. So we've got araña, gusto, ciclo, quitar, recibo, quisiera, and so on. So I would say it at least twice, and then ask them to have a go at filling in the gaps. And that's a nice sort of simple activity for year 7. You can get more difficult over time and just ask them to write the full word, and then eventually to write phrases, sentences, and then obviously moving to text level by the time they're in Key Stage 4, which will obviously mimic what's expected of them in the dictation exam. And I actually think, not just because it's what GCSE is expecting now, I do think it's really good practice that students can make the sound spelling link. It makes them better linguists as well. And then ask them to do some pronunciation. So as part of their speaking exam, obviously you'll do all the usual things that you do. You might get them to do a simple conversation, maybe a role play, maybe describe a picture. But in the year 7 in particular, ask them to pronounce a series of words that they perhaps have not come across. Therefore, they're having to apply the rules of pronunciation to new language, not just in terms of using their memory. Oh yeah, I know that I know how to pronounce tango because I just know that word off by heart. If it's new language, then you are really testing the accuracy of their pronunciation. And it's actually quite similar to the year 2 phonics test that children have to do in English, where they're actually given nonsense words. So deliberately words that they wouldn't have come across before because the words don't exist. And they have to apply their knowledge of English phonics and pronounce them. So this would be quite similar, but even better, these aren't nonsense words, they're actually real words that young people will end up needing to know for GCSE as well. So just as we said before, a sequence of phonics teaching is really important and regular review as well. Here's a suggestion of a Spanish phonics map. So which phonemes would you teach and when? I think it's really important to teach high frequency phonemes first. So your vowel sounds are obviously your most high frequency words, and the ones that do need to be really secure. You've got the QU, which comes up in some high frequency question words like que, and also comes up in quisiera and quiero, often mispronounced, often using the English qua, which does sound very un-Spanish. So it's a really important one to get right early. You've got the r sound, which is worth teaching, quite early on and practicing. And then so on, we've got the y, the ch, kako, and so on. There's not a right or wrong, but it's about using common sense. It's about looking at which are the most high frequency sounds. So that's, I've been speaking for just around 40 minutes now. So that is just coming to the end of this webinar in terms of my presentation. I was wondering if anybody has got any questions in the chat. What I'm going to do following this webinar is it will be recorded. You'll get a link to it. I'm also very happy to share the PowerPoint that goes with it if that's useful. And if you are interested in the Planetas Fonéticos as a resource, it's just coming online actually on Monday in terms of you being able to access it on a website and see the lesson plans and the resources that go with it. So just while I'm finishing off, I'm just checking the chat. And if anyone's got any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. If you want to put them in the chat or if you want to unmute and ask me them. And if not, you've probably had a very busy day and you're ready to go home or go and make some food or go and mark some books, whatever it is that you are going to do. And thank you so much for joining today. And so to be able to access the planets is the speakeasy.net website, which is on my final slide, is going to be launched on Monday, actually. So I will send you an email out with the link to this webinar with the PowerPoint, and also you'll be able to have a look on there. You'll be able to look at, download some samples, give it a go with your class, and hopefully see what you think of it. Okay, so thank you, gracias and adios. And thanks to Helen as well. Sorry you got stuck in traffic, Helen. Probably it's the worst time of day to be trying to drive. So I'm going to stop recording now. And unless there's any other questions, I'm going to come out of this.